Similar to the spirit of my last two videos, I wanted to make a video on the Timberwolves for a while now, just to do a quarter season check-in on their team and kind of talk about their roster, their title aspirations, and talk about some of the common talking points surrounding the discourse of this team. In that Lakers video, I spent a lot of that video talking about an overlooked concern I have for their team. In that Warriors video, I spent a lot of time talking about their long-term plans with their roster because I feel like this season is just a wash for them. And for the Timberwolves, I also want to spend a lot of this video talking about a specific subject. Now, while I won't give any definite conclusions on how serious their title aspirations are, or any final evaluations on their roster this season, I do feel pretty confident about one topic that people are kind of overlooking when it comes to this team, and that's if this team is the Rudy Gobert and Donovan Mitchell Jazz all over again. Now, other than literally sharing Gobert, there's a lot of striking similarities between these two teams. Of course, they have a young and up-and-coming player that a lot of people are putting superstar aspirations on, that being Donovan Mitchell on the Jazz and Anthony Edwards on the Timberwolves. So far in this regular season, they're giving me a lot of Jazz vibes from a few years ago. They're number 1 in defensive rating, and they're number 4 in net rating, which is something similar we saw with the Jazz when they had Gobert and Mitchell. They were always a top 5 defense, they always had a high net rating, and they usually had one of the best records in the league. They had a lot of hype for making some type of title run almost every year, and yet despite that, they never made it to the conference finals, and they had a lot of embarrassing losses, such as blowing a 3-1 lead to the Nuggets in the bubble, and also kind of just collapsing against the Mavericks in the last year before they blew that team up. And the way that people are talking about the Timberwolves right now gives me very similar vibes to how they were talking about the Jazz a few years ago when they still had Gobert and Mitchell. So I really just wanted to spin this video kind of evaluating whether or not the Timberwolves are at risk of a similar fate of just being hyped up in the regular season and then just having their defense totally collapse in the playoffs and not go very far at all. So really this evaluation starts with Rudy Gobert as a defender and why those Jazz teams always collapsed on defense in the playoffs. And I'll start off by saying that Rudy Gobert was not at fault for these defenses totally collapsing, despite him being their defensive anchor. I know we saw the narrative switch last year on him, and people were, saying that he's fraudulent on defense and he can't play defense in the playoffs, and things like that. But the problem with these Jazz teams was their perimeter defenders playing some of the worst defense I've seen played in the playoffs from anyone that was, considered a quote-unquote a contender. They kept their lineup consistent over the years, but in their last playoff series before they decided to blow it up, they were relying on people like Donovan Mitchell, Bojan Bogdanovic, Jordan Clarkson, and an old Mike Conley, Daniel House Jr. to basically lock down their perimeter. They also had Royce O'Neal over these years, but I felt like he was really the only positive perimeter defender they seemed to ever have. And there's really only so much Gobert can do. I know he's supposed to be the defensive anchor, but in basically all of their playoff exits, they were getting killed from the outside, not the interior, and that's not what Gobert provides. We saw in 2020 that Jamal Murray was able to absolutely cook their defenders. They put Royce O'Neal on him for most of that series, but it didn't really matter. We saw in 2021, we saw Trey Mann eliminate them, and he scored like 39 points, most of them being threes, for example. And we saw in 2022, we saw Brunson with the Mavericks just absolutely torching anyone that was in front of him. They didn't just stick Royce O'Neal in front of him the entire series. They were actually throwing basically everyone except for Gobert on them, and it just was not working whatsoever. And I know some of these examples are anecdotal, but just go back and watch the highlights for those series and look at the box scores, look at the game totals, and it's a similar case every time. The superstars were cooking the Jazz from the outside, and that's not something Rudy Gobert can do much about. Now, the Jazz were able to coast on their sneaky bad perimeter defense in the regular season because really their defensive scheme was just sending everything to Rudy Gobert into the paint so he could contest it. And that naturally makes sense because that plays to Gobert's strength and you're making him his defensive anchor. But once the Jazz got to the playoffs, things didn't really work that easily because at that point in the season, we're seeing coaches actually start to scheme for real instead of just kind of coasting in the regular season. And they start to do some outside-the-box things. And these outside-the-box things that we saw these teams that eliminated the Jazz during this time were actually playing on Gobert's weaknesses as well. And one of those weaknesses was Gobert only ever playing drop coverage against pick and roll during his time on the Jazz. We saw with Jamal Murray and Jalen Brunson especially that they were able to exploit this heavily. Jalen Brunson especially because he often likes to work between 10 and 15 feet. And there were a lot of players that were able to do this, but especially Jalen Brunson exposed this the worst because during that Mavericks series, we just saw time and time again, whoever they were sticking on Jalen Brunson for that play did not make any type of contest over that screen, and it really just led to Jalen Brunson versus Gobert and drop coverage. And while there's nothing inherently wrong with drop coverage, that was not the play for these Jazz teams because their perimeter defenders could not work through these screens to save their life. Drop coverage is fine so long as the perimeter defender is able to eventually get back to his man and stop them from taking like a 3 or a mid-range. The Jazz players were not able to do this, and because Gobert is just okay on the perimeter, is much more comfortable just playing drop coverage, we saw time and time again that teams were able to get easy buckets against the Jazz in the playoffs. And so while yes, this is on the weakness of the Jazz perimeter defense during this time, it is also on the weakness of the rigidness of Gobert's defense. Now, I know some people like to talk about Gobert like he's the perfect defender in the NBA, but he does have weaknesses, and we have seen them get exploited before. And like I said, it's fine to play drop coverage if you have good perimeter defenders, but if you don't, as the defensive center, you need to be able to not play drop coverage to cover up those weaknesses. This is not something that people like Anthony Davis or Bam would have any problem with because they're more than capable on the perimeter to play drop coverage. They can switch, they can hedge, they can trap, they can play basically any coverage you want to play when you're trying to guard the pick and roll. Gobert was only ever really trying to play drop coverage, and teams were able to exploit this heavily. The other thing they were able to exploit was Gobert's inability to exploit small ball. We saw a lot of times in the playoff series, especially against the Nuggets, that teams just went 5 out on them on offense, and it took Gobert out of the paint almost completely. And this is not something we see with Joel Embiid, for example. Sure, sometimes people will go 5 out on them, but that's because they have some type of shooting center. And basically, anytime Embiid is on the floor, we see teams are trying to throw some type of big body on him because they know if they don't, he's got a deep enough offensive bag that he's just going to be able to power through and score if you stick a smaller guy on him. That's not the case with Rudy Gobert. He doesn't really have much of a post-up game. He doesn't have great hands. He's really just a lob threat, and he stands in the dunker spot on offense. And that makes him very efficient, but he doesn't have a lot of shot creation that's able to exploit weak defenders on him. And we've seen over the years that teams aren't afraid to stick small guys on him because he's not going to exploit them on offense. So to sum all of that up before we get into the current Timberwolves team, Gobert was partially at fault for those Jazz defenses just totally collapsing in the playoffs, but that was mainly because their perimeter defenders could not do anything on the perimeter, and that led to Gobert's defensive weaknesses being exploited even heavier because of that. The Jazz failed because once Gobert was taken out of the paint against a 5-out offense, their whole defensive scheme of just sending everything to Gobert in the paint failed, and they also failed because they weren't able to help Gobert out in the pick and roll, which was partially Rudy's fault because he was only ever able to play drop coverage while some other elite defenders in the league would not be as exploitable in that situation. And now that I've kind of listed out extensively why those Jazz teams failed, we can now look at the current Timberwolves roster and the current developments going on with them and see if they're at risk for a similar fate. And I won't beat around the bush here and instead just get straight to the point. This Timberwolves team has way better perimeter defenders than those Jazz teams had inherently. Those Jazz teams were relying on people like Mike Conley and Royce O'Neal to be their go-to guys for perimeter defense, but this team actually has elite perimeter defenders on their team. They have Jaden McDaniels, for example, who's a little bit under the radar, but he's shaping up to be one of the best perimeter defenders in the league at his young age. Nickeil Alexander-Walker is in a similar state, just to a lesser extent than McDaniels. And they also have people like Ant, who played very good perimeter defense in last year's playoffs, and they also have Nas Reed, for example. And really, outside of Gobert, this is a very athletic and switchable defense. I really don't expect them to be getting exploited heavily on pick and roll, kind of like what those Jazz teams had, because people like McDaniels and Alexander Walker and Nas Reed, and even Ant sometimes, are very good at guarding the pick and roll and very good at getting back to their man, which helps with Gobert since he only ever really wants to play drop coverage. And those ideas that I'm mentioning have been somewhat proven in the playoffs last year, unlike with those Jazz teams. We saw in their series against the Nuggets that Jamal Murray wasn't able to absolutely cook them in the pick and roll. Now, obviously, the Gobert and Jamal Murray pick and roll was near unguardable in last year's playoff run, but I thought the Timberwolves did a decent job at defending it, and their perimeter defenders were able to get around these screens well, and this enabled Gobert to really rely on his drop coverage without getting absolutely cooked, because those perimeter defenders were able to actually play their part in these drop coverages and get back on their mans. And even on Gobert's part, I saw a little bit of improvement in his defense on the pick and roll, and this may come down to coaching, but Gobert was not playing drop coverage on every single pick and roll play. He actually was switching sometimes, and sometimes he would kind of sell the switch and go back into drop coverage, but I thought he was doing enough to at least keep the defensives honest and guessing instead of just having him being a clear exploitable weakness. So it wasn't their defense in last year's playoffs that collapsed, it was their offense. Ants had a phenomenal series where he averaged 31.5 points, but Cat had a very bad series where he averaged about 18 points and was very inefficient at that. And outside of those two players, it didn't really feel like their team had a lot of shot creation or playmaking. Felt like they had a lot of athletes and a lot of people that were able to play defense, but when it came to offense, they were really relying on Ants for everything, and that just wasn't enough to push through in the end. And their offensive concerns are still carrying over to this season, as they're only 17th in offensive rating, which is a little bit sus for a contender, as you've seen in the post-KD Warriors era. Every championship team has had a top 10 offense at least, and really the only exception to this was the Warriors. However, they had some players that really stepped it up in the playoffs and that was able to fix some of their offensive woes from that regular season. And I'm not going to get too deep into this now because it is still early in the season, and I do feel like I need to watch them a little bit more before I really judge their offense completely. But I do feel pretty certain that they don't have a team that's going to be able to compete offensively with a team like the Suns or the Mavericks, for example. And while that's fine because they should be able to play way better defense than them, I do think that their offense needs to improve a little bit going into the postseason because it's looking a little bit shaky right now, at least for a team that's trying to vie for a title. And this is something I plan on talking a little bit later in the season when I feel a bit more familiar with this team and we're closer to the playoffs. But as for right now, I'll say this about this team to kind of sum up everything I've said. I don't think they have the offensive ceiling that other West contenders have. I don't think they're going to be better than the Nuggets, the Mavericks, and the Suns on offense in the playoffs. And really that just has to come down to personnel. So I really do feel like if they're going to make a deep run in the playoffs, they're going to need both Ant and Cat playing on their A game on offense. As for their defense, I'm feeling pretty confident for them in the playoffs, and I don't think that they're a repeat of the Jazz, even though I do feel like that was worth noting. I do want to see them go against some potential 5-out lineups with Rudy Gobert being taken out of the paint as a result of that, and kind of see how their defense fares as a result of that. But overall, I don't think defense is going to be the reason why this Timberwolves team's season potentially ends early. I think it's their offense because they're only 17th in offensive rating right now, which I think a lot of people aren't really looking at. And just looking at their personnel, they don't have the offensive ceiling that some of these other Western Conference teams have. But it's still early in the season, and things are probably going to change a lot by the next time that I talk about this team. But as of right now, I'll say that their offense is something that people need to be looking at a little bit more closely, as they are 17th in offensive rating, and I think that their offensive ceiling is a little bit shaky as well. But by the next time I talk about them, I will probably be talking about how serious I think they are as a title contender and give a more definite answer to that question. But anyway, if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe if you want to see more videos in the future. Comment something you have something to say. And thank y'all for watching. I guess I'll see y'all next time.